Hey guys, welcome back to my video. Today we are going to be going over some of my fixes for a really common yet probably the most infuriating sewing machine issue that you might come in contact with, and that is whenever you're sewing and your needle is actually pushing the fabric down below the throat plate into the bobbin area. And usually what happens is you either get a huge massive thread on the underneath side because it's not feeding the fabric through, or sometimes it will cause a hole because it pushes the fabric actually down into the bobbin area. I've had times on older sewing machines where I've had to go into the bobbin area and physically cut the thread out and try and like wrangle the fabric out of there, and it's never ended well. So hopefully these tips help you guys to be able to avoid this issue and have a beautiful sewing project to show for it.
Okay guys, the very first thing that you want to check is your needle. If it's been a while since you've changed it, you're definitely going to do that first, because if your needle gets too dull, it's very easy for it to, instead of puncturing through the fibers of your material, just pushing it right down into the bobbin area, and we don't want that. So that is the very first thing that you're going to want to check. Okay, so the next thing that you can do if your machine is eating your fabric is switch out your stitch plate, specifically if it's happening when you are using a straight stitch. So here you can see this is like a standard stitch plate, and it's quite wide where the needle is at, so you can do a zigzag. But if you're doing a straight stitch, you don't need all that space, and you can switch out your stitch plate for one that accommodates a straight stitch, and then there's less room for your fabric to get pushed down into the bobbin area. Not every machine comes with one, and not every machine has the option to buy one as an extra accessory, so definitely check and see if you have one or have one available to purchase, because it's not available to everyone, unfortunately. Moving on to actually sewing, this is a really simple technique that you can try before moving on to the slightly more complicated ones. But basically, if your machine doesn't require you to pull the bobbin thread up to the top, you're going to want to go ahead and do that. So just hold your needle thread and crank the hand wheel until it brings the bottom thread up. You might have to do it a few times to make sure that there's enough thread for you to grab. But once you pull that up, what we're going to do is we're going to start sewing like normally, except we're going to hold on to those thread tails and give them a little bit of tension when we first start sewing. That way there's not a chance for it to push your fabric down. Instead, you're slightly pulling your fabric by using those threads, and you're helping feed the fabric through just to get it started, and that's going to help keep it from getting pushed down into the bobbin area. Also, ignore my back stitching. This machine doesn't require like a regular back stitch. It does a knot for you, and so I forgot and did a back stitch last minute, so ignore my terrible sewing. So normally whenever I'm sewing and I'm not having any kind of issues with, my fabric not feeding or whatever, I start my fabric pretty close to where the needle hole is at, if not directly underneath the needle. But if we're having issues with our fabric not feeding properly, sometimes you need to have a little bit of that grip underneath the foot in order for it to feed properly. So what I like to do is start the fabric just a little bit further underneath my presser foot. That way it has something to grip onto. And if you're worried about that gap, what I do is instead of sewing forward, back stitching, and then, continuing on, I actually will just go straight into a back stitch and then sew forward. And I haven't had any issues with this. The only thing you need to look out for really is if it's a very visible seam line, or like top stitching, for instance, you might not want to put your fabric too far underneath the foot, because, your back stitch is going to be longer if you do that, and it's not always the best look if you're using like contrasting thread or something like what I'm doing here. So that's the only thing you really need to worry about whenever you're doing this method. And my last tip is a little bit of a last resort, because most sewers aren't going to have tearaway stabilizer just laying around unless you also do machine embroidery. But basically, tearaway stabilizer is just something that you use to give some stability to your fabric, and then you tear it away immediately afterwards, so it doesn't stay in your project like a regular stabilizer might. This is meant to actually be torn away, but if you don't have access to it, you can also use paper, and that works great as well. It's just not as great when it comes to getting rid of all the little bits. The tearaway stabilizer comes away a little bit easier. So for this method, you're just going to take a couple inches of that stabilizer, and you can use scrap if you have it laying around, that works too. And you're just going to put it behind your fabric, and you're going to sew like you normally would. There is no need for you to start sewing further in on the fabric, because the stabilizer generally is going to beef your fabric up enough that you're going to be able to start right on the edge, which is why I really like this method for top stitching, because whenever I top stitch, I really don't care for a long back stitch. I don't think that that looks as nice. So I prefer to use this, that way I can have a smaller back stitch.
Okay guys, that is all of the tips that I have for you today. If you guys have any additional tips for this particular issue, please leave them down in the comments below. You guys have helped me so much. Y'all have taught me so many things, and I know that other people in the comments have also learned quite a bit from you guys. So if you have any secret tips that you guys want to share, please leave them down below, because I know that there's at least a few viewers that have landed on this video because your fabric is currently stuck in your machine. So please help each other out in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.